Hello, scholars. This is Dr. Kara Stillen, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In our last video, we looked at the presidency of George Washington as well as John Adams. During this video, we're going to look at the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. For those of you that are homeschooling or teaching in the school systems, please note there are links to worksheet packets that correspond with each of these videos. When the U.S. Constitution was written, the Founding Fathers were extremely worried about political parties dominating the country. The fear was that political parties would bring an end to our nation. I think I'm just going to leave that one there for you to think about. The election of 1800 featured two of the same individuals as in the 1796 election. This election featured incumbent John Adams against Thomas Jefferson. Many American citizens worried that if Thomas Jefferson won the presidency, there would be an uprising by slaves. Jefferson's running mate was Aaron Burr, and Burr and Jefferson received the same amount of votes. This meant the House of Representatives would choose who would become President of the United States. Aaron Burr had quite a temperament, which probably kept him from winning, and therefore Thomas Jefferson became the third President of the United States. The pomp and circumstance of the Washington presidency and the spending of the Adams presidency came to a halt with President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a Democrat-Republican, which was eventually shortened to Republican. Now, when you hear Republican, this does not mean the same thing as what it is today in 2020. The ideologies were very different. This can be really confusing for students who know of the Democrat and Republican parties in 2020 and think that they are the same as the ones before. They're just not. As a Republican, Thomas Jefferson shifted the nature of the presidency. For his inauguration, he wore everyday clothing and refused the formality of the swearing-in ceremony. Jefferson was extremely simple and didn't believe in a strong federal government. President Jefferson did not believe in a national bank either, nor did he like the spending that Washington and Adams took part in. Jefferson attempted to cut the budget wherever he could. He even refused to throw big parties at the White House. This might have been because his wife died 18 years before he entered the White House. If Jefferson did have individuals over, it was very small dinner parties, and he often wore slippers when he hosted guests. Jefferson wasn't a fan of women and attempted to stay away from them. He knew of Martha Washington's role as well as Abigail Adams, but he was fine with being secluded. Jefferson aligned with the rural farmers better than rich men and wanted to benefit them during his presidency. He couldn't stand rich men and their attempts to be greedy and use people in the process. Jefferson was able to cut federal spending, including the military, both standing soldiers and the Navy. He got rid of whiskey taxes as well as federal taxes. Some thought that Jefferson was way too cheap, but he was extremely successful with cutting the national debt. The only money that Jefferson spent was on the post office, the court systems, and the census. Jefferson even cut the executive branch's employees to a little over 100 within a year of his presidency. In his first month into his presidency, Jefferson found out that President John Adams appointed over 200 Federalists, which was Adams' political party, to various judicial, military, and ambassador positions. In 1789, Adams established the Judicial Act, where he set up circuit courts and a Supreme Court with 6 members. He made sure to put John Marshall into the Supreme Court in the 6th seat. Marshall was a strong Federalist, much like Adams. The mail could not move as fast as what Adams wanted, and some of the appointments were not delivered back to President Adams in time. When Jefferson found out about these appointments, he was furious and decided not to honor those appointments that did not arrive in time, and Federalist Americans grew extremely angry. The Secretary of State for President Thomas Jefferson, who was James Madison, was sued by William Marbury because the president did not honor his appointment. The case ended up going to the Supreme Court in 1803 and was called Marbury v. Madison. John Marshall presided over the case, and the Supreme Court ruled that even though the appointment should have been honored by President Thomas Jefferson, the Supreme Court did not have the power to make the executive branch honor it. The Supreme Court was able to establish the legal authority to decide if cases coincided with the U.S. Constitution. While the Supreme Court was busy hearing the case of Marbury versus Madison, the President and Congress were working on purchasing the Louisiana Territory. The Louisiana Territory was a huge area of land west of the Mississippi River. It belonged to France, and the American government wanted to expand westward. There was some land that was claimed by Spain, especially the area of New Orleans and its surroundings. The American government knew that France had been in tumultuous warfare with England and was in need of money. Congress knew it might be a good time to try to secure that land. The government got along pretty well with Spain and shared the waterways for many years, but for whatever reason, Spain decided to revolt against the Americans shipping their goods down the river near New Orleans. There were rumors that Spain was going to sell its land rights to France, and the American government knew they had to do something about it. Spain had been a pretty good neighbor, but they knew France was not going to be. President Thomas Jefferson decided to send Robert R. Livingston to France in an attempt to purchase New Orleans. France stated they knew nothing about owning New Orleans until Livingston hinted that the U.S. was thinking about invading it. France completely turned on a dime and began talking about selling New Orleans as well as the Louisiana Territory. The numbers were all over the board, from 60 to 120 million France sought. Livingston was a good negotiator and just walked away. Within a couple days, France returned to Livingston with a deal for 15 million for everything. The French had to have the money for their wars with England, so they made a deal they knew the Americans would accept. In 1803, the U.S. officially gained over 800,000 square miles of land known as the Louisiana Territory. President Thomas Jefferson named his trusted secretary, Meriwether Lewis, as the leader of a secret and semi-military mission into the Louisiana Territory and beyond. Jefferson wanted information about the land, waterways, and their directions, and any plants or animals that they found. Lewis was only 28 years old, and he knew he needed someone else to help him lead the expedition. Meriwether Lewis called on William Clark to help lead the expedition. Clark was from Kentucky and had experience fighting in the 1790 wars against various Native American tribes. The two men chose crew members that could navigate rivers, were hunters, gunsmiths, and translators, and all the crew members were about 45 men. Clark also brought one of his slaves named York. The Lewis and Clark expedition began in St. Louis in the spring of 1804. They entered the Missouri River and were able to get to North Dakota by the winter, where Native American tribes were familiar with French and British fur traders there. York, Clark's slave, had quite an interesting time in North Dakota, as many Native Americans were amazed by his skin color. They'd never seen a man with this skin color before, and many tribes members ran up to him and tried to rub off what they believed to be paint on his skin. The expedition picked up a 16-year-old Shawnee woman by the name of Sacajawea. She had been taken at 10 years old and was sold to a French trapper. The Frenchman made her his wife, and she knew many languages, and this made her extremely valuable to Lewis and Clark. They also knew that if they had Sacajawea with them, the tribes would see Lewis and Clark as less of a threat, and this was exactly what happened. Fast forward to 1805, and Lewis and Clark eventually made it from North Dakota to the Pacific Ocean via the Columbia River. It was officially the end of their expedition, and this is when they headed home. When they finally got back to President Thomas Jefferson, they were celebrated as national heroes. They returned with various types of soils, maps of the land, and information concerning various Native American tribes. President Thomas Jefferson knew that westward expansion would definitely help the government and the country to advance and profit. It wasn't difficult to determine that President Jefferson would gain a second term when the election came. He won very easily in 1804. Jefferson's second term started off, though, with conflict as battles between France and England spilled over into America in 1806. The British began stopping American cargo ships, inspecting their contents, and taking the crew members under their control if they saw fit. In retaliation, the American government started to ban various British goods. The matters became worse when in 1807 an American ship by the name of the Chesapeake was stopped near the Chesapeake Bay by a British ship called the Leopard. When the British demanded to search the American ship and the crew refused, the British began firing on the American ship and killed 3 American crew members within U.S. territory. Americans were furious. Congress quickly passed the Embargo Act of 1807, stating it was illegal to have any British goods within the nation. Americans did not want war, but they wanted to make the British nation suffer for their actions. Unfortunately, this blew up in the face of America. Unemployment rose, the price of grain fell astronomically, cotton in the South did not get picked, and other crops died in the soil. The economy dropped and the Federalist Party's popularity started to rise again. President Jefferson knew he wasn't going to win another election and didn't even bother to run for another term. The election of 1804 rivaled Republican James Madison against Federalist Charles Pinckney. Many were surprised when Madison won the presidency. James Madison's wife may have been a big reason why he won. Dolly Madison was an extremely talented and smart woman. Dolly knew how to talk and bring people together. After her husband won, she held receptions, dinners, and balls at the White House, and it was she who eventually coined the name the White House. It was during this election that women began writing recommendations for men that were running for office. Women definitely wanted a place in politics and demanded to somehow be part of it all. Dolly Madison not only had gatherings at the White House, but she also opened it up for the public to view. The place was like a palace, and Dolly created 3 rooms that she would show off to guests. The Madison parties were extremely popular and went on for hours. People ate, talked, walked about. Dolly Madison's parties were called the Squeeze or the Crush, where they got the important information about what was happening in Congress, in the city, as well as within the nation. Dolly Madison wanted to be in the know because she knew it would help her husband to govern smoothly. The one growing tension that the Madisons probably didn't have a good idea about was the collaboration of the Native Americans and their continued unrest with the American people. Tecumseh was a Shawnee chief at the time of James Madison's presidency. His other name was Shooting Star, and he was born in the Ohio country in the mid-1700s. There were about 12 Native American tribes within the region, and Tecumseh watched as his father and his 2 brothers were struck down in war against the Americans, or who they called Big Knives. He was a child when the Big Knives came multiple times and burned down their villages as well as their crops. Tecumseh and his tribe fled from the Big Knives in order to stay alive. As he moved from boyhood to adulthood, Tecumseh became an incredible warrior. He was extremely angry with the Americans for unfairly taking Native American land. As more and more tension grew between the Native American tribes as well as the Americans, certain tribes members tried to assimilate with the Americans in order to relieve tension. They intermarried and became farmers. Those that attempted to stay on their lands were given finished goods and alcohol for many years in exchange for their land. When the government got the tribes hooked on alcohol, they didn't bring anything but alcohol in order to control the tribes. Tecumseh watched more and more of his people fall prey to alcohol, including his own brother. He wanted to help his people return to their original lifestyle, and he knew he needed to bring the various tribes together. Tecumseh refused to drink any alcohol that was given to him, and he began traveling and speaking to Native American tribes, asking them to join his Pan-Indian Confederacy. Tecumseh wasn't afraid of his mission and made sure all could hear his words. Many Americans feared him, but also saw him as extremely charismatic. When William Henry Harrison saw Tecumseh starting to gain a following with his movement, he began warning people. Harrison was a territorial governor of Indiana, and so he had a front row to see what was happening. In 1805, Tecumseh's brother, who was struggling with alcohol addiction, had a very strong vision in which he met the Master of Life, who gave him a new name, the Prophet. The Master of Life told him the white people were born of the evil spirit and that they needed to be destroyed. Tecumseh's brother stopped drinking alcohol immediately, eventually withdrawing from it. The brothers established a village in Indiana called Prophetstown. The goal of Prophetstown was to consolidate various Native American tribes to reestablish their beliefs, lifestyles, and gain spirituality. As the village grew, Tecumseh continued traveling and speaking to tribes. He wanted as many individuals in the Indian Confederacy as possible. When Tecumseh was on one of his famous speaking trips in 1805, William Henry Harrison gathered 3 Native American tribe chiefs and proposed the Treaty of Fort Wayne. This would give Americans 3 million acres of land for 2 cents an acre. Harrison also told the chiefs that this would be the last treaty that Americans would ask for, and the chiefs agreed to the treaty. When Tecumseh returned and found out about the treaty, he was mad as heck and let everybody know it. When he left again, though, on another speaking engagement, Harrison attacked Prophetstown with 1,000 soldiers. The battle lasted 2 hours, and 62 Americans and 40 Native Americans were killed before the Native Americans took off. In his final act of the battle, Harrison torched the town and watched it burn. When Tecumseh returned, he knew he was going to take the Native Americans into battle with the big knives. After the burning of Prophetstown, President Jefferson knew war was coming. In 1812, America declared war on Great Britain. The war was definitely a disaster for everybody. As was hypothesized, the Native Americans aligned with the British, hoping an American defeat would bring back their land. Battles took place in areas of Florida, the Great Lakes, and in the area of Tennessee. It was in the War of 1812 where Andrew Jackson grew extremely popular. In the Creek War in 1814, Jackson led 2,000 militiamen into a battle named Horseshoe Bend. Jackson and his troops killed 550 Native Americans and hundreds more as the tribes attempted to flee. When Jackson finally won the battle, he forced Native Americans to give up more land through a really bad treaty. Tecumseh died in the battle in Canada near the border. He wouldn't live long enough to see the British sail into the capital and come ashore, burning everything as they ran. There was panic everywhere as the British came onto the land near the Chesapeake Bay. There were families screaming and trying to grab their personal belongings before they fled. The banks tried to hide their money, and Dolly Madison was actually throwing a dinner party when she heard about the invasion. She and her guests screamed and left their dinner sitting there as they fled. Rumor has it the British ate her dinner before they burned the White House down to the ground. Yes, you heard that right. The White House you see right now is not the White House that existed 200 years ago. It had to be rebuilt. The British also torched the Capitol, and when they burned as much as they could, they headed north for Baltimore so they could destroy it as well. The Maryland militia was there to stop them. The British then tried to attack New York City 2 weeks later, but the Navy was ready to stop them in their tracks as well. In 1850, the British landed in New Orleans, but General Andrew Jackson was there with his troops to greet them. 80 Americans were killed, but 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers died. The American people celebrated the great victory of General Andrew Jackson and his men. It made Jackson a national hero. When the war ended, the Americans shot off fireworks and partied in the streets. Patriotism climbed, and Congress passed the 1817 Rush-Bagot Disarmament Treaty, which limited the country's naval vessels and cannon. It was interesting that after the War of 1812, the role of women began to change. In the 1820s and 30s, some women began going to school. They learned math and reading from the ages of 6 to 11 years old. As the years continued, the curriculum grew harder. It wasn't long before women reached the academic levels of men. If parents were willing to pay money, any private organization would educate women into adulthood. It wasn't long, though, before individuals were claiming that women made better teachers than men. Why not have women teach for a couple years and then they could get married and have children? Various educational institutions made sure they didn't educate women to an extreme. They believed this would make women unmarriable. Education definitely meant that women would begin seeking more from their environment, and they sure did. The elections of 1816 and 1820 brought James Monroe to the presidency. Monroe ran against Federalist Rufus King and won. He only won, though, by 1 electoral vote. The Federalist Party was declared dead after this election, and many thought this would be a time of peace throughout the nation. The cracks within the party did not show until Missouri applied for admission to the Union, and many began fighting about the issue of slavery. There were already 10,000 plus slaves present within Missouri brought in by Southerners. Those that owned slaves in Missouri thought that an end to slavery would be an end to their agricultural businesses. James Talmadge Jr. of New York brought forth 2 amendments. The first amendment stated that once Missouri became a state, any child born to a slave in Missouri could be free by 25 years of age. The Second Amendment stated that no new slaves could be brought into Missouri. Southerners, of course, hated the amendments. Many in the North wanted to see slavery abolished because of the 3/5 clause. Northerners did not want for those in the South to have so much representation because of individuals that weren't even free. The House of Representatives voted for the 2 amendments, but the Senate voted against them. In 1820, a compromise came about. The territory of Maine applied for statehood in 1820, and because Maine was going to be a free state with no slavery accepted, Missouri could be accepted as a slave state. The southern boundary of Missouri would now draw a symbolic line between the northern states that were anti-slavery and the southern states that accepted slavery. Other than the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Monroe Doctrine was the other extremely important event that took place during President Monroe's service to the country. President Monroe recognized that further European colonization on either American continent could be troublesome. President Monroe declared that any further colonization on either American continent would be considered an act of aggression to the United States. In return, Americans agreed to stay out of European matters. President Monroe realized that if America could take advantage of the relationships with countries on either continent, it would help them greatly. James Monroe was the very last president as well to wear a powdered wig and shortened pants. The election of 1824 rivaled John Quincy Adams against Andrew Jackson. John's wife, Louise Catherine Adams, had a big impact on her husband's win. She remodeled her home and invited hundreds of guests over for parties. The 1824 election had a ballot full of Republicans and 5 serious candidates, so wives knew their husbands had to stick out to win. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, the second president, and he wanted very badly to become president. He wanted to be just like his father and was able to do so. He even mimicked his father so much that he didn't win a second term of office, just like his father had not. Americans were quite surprised when General Andrew Jackson entered the presidential race as a latecomer. In the end, Jackson ended up receiving 99 electoral votes, whereas John Quincy Adams earned 84 electoral votes. Neither individual had a majority, so the House of Representatives had to decide which man would become president. John Quincy Adams won by 1 vote. Adams had some pretty lofty ideas about what he wanted to do with the nation, including building canals, harbors, and roads. He also wanted a national university in Washington, D.C. Many citizens feared that Adams would extend the power of the federal government way too far. Adams' inability to work with Congress meant that his support lessened over time. Therefore, John Quincy Adams was not able to successfully implement many of his programs into the United States. All right, we're going to end there. But if you like this video, please click on that like button and don't forget to subscribe so you get all the information on when these new videos come out. I thank you very much for watching and listening, and I will talk with you soon.